Hey YouTube, hello. So I'm recording this video to show people who are like fucking giga nerds just like me how to, you know, actually calculate your DPS on Torchlight and figure out how much damage you're actually doing. I think it's a very important skill to have. It's very useful for min-maxing, and it also makes it much easier for you to figure out what upgrades are the most cost efficient. This is going to be a very complicated video, but I'm going to try my hardest to break it down as easy as possible. So calculating the damage that you do in this game is basically a three-step process. If you look at the in-game help menu, it actually has a damage calculation part of it, which just says the damage in this game is calculated by your base damage, multiplied by all your damage increase percentages, multiplied by all your additional damage buckets. So this has additional damage percentage 1, additional damage percentage 2. Those are separate buckets of additional damage, and I'll show you what that means now. When you calculate your damage, let's start off with the most important thing, your base damage. Your base damage is essentially how much damage the skill is doing. Now, this is very slightly different for both attack skills and spell skills, but the way it actually works is pretty much the exact same. So we're going to use Thunderbolt Overload. This is my character that I pushed to 4054 in Dragon with earlier in the season, which I did upload a video for. And I'm also going to be using my current build, which I'm making to try and beat my dragon by a large amount. Okay? So Thunderbolt Overload is a skill that has these mechanics to it. It has effectiveness of added damage, and this is something you'll see on both spell skills and attack skills. And then it has the flat damage that does. All spell skills tend to come with flat damage like this, whereas attack skills do not generally have that. And then it has the mechanics of the skill. In this case, Thunderbolt can jump 2 times. I'll get to that later. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at level 30 Thunderbolt, and you'll see that it has a damage effectiveness of 95%, and it deals 386 to 643 base damage. So in our sheet, we're going to calculate that. We'll have any base damage that we're adding to our skill is going to have a 95% effectiveness. And then what sources of base damage you have, what sources of flat damage you have. Because if you've ever had a, items that's like, oh yeah, adds X to X amount of flat damage to your gear, this is where that damage is being added to the base damage of your spell skill. So in our build, our wands had this 32 cold damage implicit, which is why we have ×2 cold damage. We have our dexterity, which is converting our dex into flat lightning damage, which I calculate here on the dex tab, which in the end comes out to 6010 flat damage. And then we have the base damage of the spell, which if you take this range and you just average it out, on average, it is going to be 514.5 base spell damage. And there we have our base damage. One single projectile from the Thunderbolt Overload is going to hit for this amount. Now, this is where you do need to test a bit and just experiment with things yourself. The way Thunderbolt works, when I tested it, is this line here. Cast a skill that throws a Thunderbolt that can jump 2 times. What that means is it's going to hit the ground and then jump and hit the ground again. But this is a parabolic skill, and parabolic skills have access to parabolic splits. And the way parabolic splits work is that once the skill hits the ground, it is going to split into however many projectiles you have splitting, and then those projectiles are going to hit the ground and bounce again. And with our setup, we have access to +1 jump here, and then 2 jumps here. So the first initial projectile hitting the ground counts as a bounce, and then we have 2 additional bounces afterwards, and my build had 8 splits. And what this looks like is that in reality, I am firing out each Thunderbolt I shoot out is splitting and hitting 17 times. And I calculate that here, and that is how we get our base projectile damage, which we have over here. Then we have our additive damage, our additional damage and our additive damage. Additive damage is that first thing where it's like all damage percent increases. This is very easy to calculate. Just look at your gear, your pack spreads, all those things. And anywhere you see lines like this, 139% spell damage, 126 elemental damage, 12% lightning damage, 24% lightning damage, you're just gonna go and add all of these up, as well as adding the base, because you have a base of 100. You know, you have a base of 100 spell damage. And that's what I do here. So I add everything up as a percentage. It comes out to 645%, which is equivalent to 6.45 more multiplier. But you have a base percentage of 100 spell damage, which then we get the 7.45. And that's the additive damage dealt with. Okay? Then for additional damage, this is where things get a bit more, not complicated, but more effort that you have to put in to calculate everything. So the way that additional spell damage works in this game is everything is multiplicative of everything, with maybe some very, very niche scenarios where it's not the case. But like in this build, we didn't incur any of those niche scenarios. And what you can look at is like, if you look at your gear, right? 3% additional damage while having fervor. And I just wrote that down right here, Clouds mode, 1.3. The way you're going to convert all of your additional damages is if it's 30%, you just write down as 1.3. If it's 5%, it's 1.05. If it is minus 9%, you do 1 minus 0.09, which is 0.91. And then just going through all of our skills, you know, look at our links. We have a 6% burst, so it's 1.06. We have a 56% psychic burst, so it's 1.56. We are going to write all those additional numbers down, and we're going to multiply them all together, because that's how you work with additional damage. You multiply them together. Crit damage is also an additional multiplier. You don't multiply your crit with each other, but you do need to add up your crit damage together and then multiply it with your other additional multipliers. And if your skill goes beyond level 30, you just do this. Every level of your skill beyond 30 is just 10% additional damage. So yeah, I did 1.1 to the power of 6, which is essentially the same as just saying this number multiplied with itself times 6. Like multiplied with itself 6 times. And that is quite overwhelming, I'll be honest with you. But there is ways to separate everything into different sheets and make it a lot more breathable and easy to understand. So for example, I am getting 37.5% or 37.5 more damage from my lightning, which is 3,750% additional lightning damage. The way that I made that easier for myself to handle is I do all of my pack spread calculations over here. This is all my pack spread and how much dex I'm getting from it. Then over here, I do all of my dex calculations. And you see this pack spread here? Well, now I don't need to worry about it because I already calculated it. I get all of my flat dex together. I get all of my percent dex together. And now look, I can calculate my total dex out just that easily. And now that I have my total dex, I can very easily figure things out, like how much damage does a 1% per 8 dex mod give? How much does the dex per cast speed sight give me? How much movement speed do I get from dex? How much additional damage do I get from dex? How much flat damage do I get from dex? And now we do have lucky damage. So the way that we're calculating lucky damage here is we're using this formula, which is just, just Google the formula for lucky damage. That's just how it works. And also, because our build has 15% additional max damage in it, which is this mod, we are calculating it here in our lucky damage, because our max roll of our max roll in our roll range is slightly higher. Is this the perfect way to calculate? No. This is not 100% perfect, because we do have other base rolls, such as the actual spell's base roll, but this is close enough. And that's just something that was like a slight oversight when I was making the sheet, that in hindsight, like, oh yeah, I should have accounted for that. But it's okay to make 1 or 2 mistakes. As long as you just double check things and you realize those mistakes, you can fix them afterwards. Another stat that might be a bit confusing for people to know how to work with is Armor Pen and Elite Pen. While this is not 100% confirmed, as far as we are aware, the dragon has 50% armor mitigation against first damage and 30% mitigation against elemental damage. And then he also has 30% mitigation just from Elite Pen. So his armor and his elemental resist gives him 30 res and 30 res. And the way you're calculating this is you just combine all of your penetration together and you minus it from this. So, you know, the dragon's gonna have minus 52% elemental pen, which means that he's taking 52% more damage from our elemental hits, which means we have a 1.52 multiplier. And because we don't have 30 armor pen, the dragon is actually taking reduced damage from us, which is why we have 0.84 here. And then when we multiply these two numbers together on our additional page, which you'll see right here, then we get our actual more damage multiplier from penetration, which is also why it's very good to have both armor and Elite Pen, because if you don't have the enemies in negative resistances, you're actually dealing less damage to them, which is, you know, really bad. Any source of less damage like this, or this, actually hampers your damage quite a lot. And then similarly, I just went through it. I got all my candles together, I got all of my skills together, all of my supports together. For proj speed, because that's quite a lot to deal with, I calculate all the proj speed separately, and then multiply it by 0.6 to figure out how much we're getting from Gale. You know, to figure out our Gale damage. And did the same for like my leftover mods, did the same for my talent tree, you know, just went through, made sure everything is correct. And then at the very end, when I am confident of all of my things, I've calculated everything out, I'm multiplying all of these numbers together to get us our total additional damage. And that's the third key of the puzzle, our total additional damage. And with these 3 numbers, we can figure out our DPS. But you might have noticed there's another thing here, trigger rate. Why is trigger rate important? So, trigger rate is basically just your cast speed or your attack speed. So this game has quite a lot of just weird, confusing nonsense that has to do with frames and shit. And the best way that you can go and test how much your weapon is actually hitting for, your skill's actually hitting for, if it's a single, especially if it's a single target skill, like a skill that hits only once, is to actually go on a dummy, equip erosion support, and then hit the dummy. So you'll see here, we are hitting 15 volt stacks consistently, which means our split shot is hitting 15 times a second. Most skills, the number that you see here on the dummy, this like attack speed that you're gonna see, is accurate with the amount of attacks you can do per second. There are also niche cases such as Splitshot, which do not follow this rule, and Reap cooldown, which does not follow this rule. And I do recommend that you do some testing with that and try to get info related to that if you're not sure about your skill. But I'll say, like, in 99% of cases, you're probably going to be fine without this. So I add all of my cast speed together, which this is all my additive cast speed. I get all of my additional cast speed, which I have Thunder Megas, which gives us additional cast speed. And we have Quick Decision on our Path of Flames. Multiply them together. And then we have our total cast speed. And we're multiplying this by 3. Because if you look at a skill like Path of Flames, it actually has a cast speed, a base cast speed of 3. Which means this automatically is casting 3 times a second. So if we multiply our cast speed by 774%, now it's casting 23 times in a second, instead of just 3 times in a second. And that's how I calculate my trigger rate. Now, if you're using a rain of arrows and you're using, a trigger skill, like rhythm, it's much easier to figure this out because a 0.2 rhythm is quite simply just a trigger rate of 5. A 0.3 rhythm is just a trigger rate of 3.33. It's a lot easier to calculate. But if you have all this information together, you can just multiply together to get your final damage, which in this dragon pushing build, which got to 4045 eventually, is roughly 1.5 quadrillion damage, or DPS. And on our Rain of Arrows build that we're working on, I'm quickly going to showcase how I worked with this using Rain of Arrows. Just to give you another example. So Rain of Arrows has a base damage effectiveness of 415%, and then it fires one projectile, and it fires a projectile of its base in its base state, and it has additional projectile quantity, but each projectile beyond the initial one has a shotgun coefficient of 70%. This means, a shotgun fall off coefficient of 70%. This means every hit beyond the first hit is doing only 30% damage. So when we calculate this, we have a weapon first, which very easy to do. You just go in your cane, this number here, 178 physical damage, that's your weapon physical damage. A lot easier than spells to deal with. We have our flat lightning damage, which again is coming from a dexterity sheet, which I did all the calculations and things here that was relevant. We get these together and then we multiply it by 4.15, which is the base damage coefficient, the effectiveness of the skill, which is 415%. We multiply it all together, and now we know the damage of our first projectile. Our initial hit is doing 39,000 without any sort of scaling on it. And I have 18 additional projectiles. My projectile count is 18 bonus projectiles. This is not, in total we shoot 90 projectiles, but 18 of these are the ones that I'm calculating now to figure out the fall off coefficient. And I just do this formula, which basically takes these 18. Actually, sorry, this is my total projectile quant, 18. I forgot that I counted for that. And what this is literally doing is it's just taking our first projectile, multiplying it by the initial hit damage, and then taking the rest of the projectiles and taking off the shotgun coefficient to give us this number, which is our Rain of Arrows damage if all the arrows hit. In most cases, all the arrows will not be hitting. I am calculating this for the dragon, where I can assume that everything will be hitting. And this is something that you can pretty much use for any skill in this game, and any mechanic in this game. There are some mechanics that you might not understand how it works. I wasn't 100% sure how TBO worked. I literally just simplified the problem by unequipping all of my gear and just shooting out one Thunderbolt. And when I shot out the one Thunderbolt, I saw it would bounce, it would hit the ground and then bounce once, which means that it can jump 2 times, means that the initial hit counts as one of those 2 jumps. Then I got one projectile split, and I saw if one projectile split, it would bounce again, and then bounce again. Which means that on the initial bounce, it would split into the one projectile, and then that one projectile would bounce again. Then I tried it with 2 projectile splits, and I saw it would bounce, split into 2, and then each one of those 2 projectiles would bounce again. And you can do this for like literally every skill in the game, which is like, just play around with it, test it a bit, and just see like if it's, try to figure out the mechanics of the skill and then put it down as basically as possible on a spreadsheet. Now, there's one last thing that I want to show you, which is relevant to the cast speed thing. If you are a Splitshot player, the frame rules does apply to your skill. And what that means as a Splitshot player is that if you look at my cast speed right now on this build, I have, let me just move my model. I have a cast speed of 15 per second, which means that we are reaching 15 will stacks. You see how we consistently have 15? It will sometimes tick over to 16, don't worry about that. That is our will stacks, which the will stacks apply every single time we hit it, because we have dirty tricks, and we're only hitting it with one projectile at a time. Now, if I increase my cast speed by equipping quick decision support, and by going into my talent tree and adding this attack speed protects, we're increasing our cast speed all the way up to 24.7 per second. Do you see that we're still only applying 15 volts though? The reason we are doing that is this skill in particular, Splitshot, has breakpoints where if your cast speed or attack speed is between 10 and 15, you're only going to hit 10 times a second. If your cast speed is between 15 and 29.9, you're only hitting 15 times a second. The second you reach 30, you're hitting 30 times per second. I did get this character up to 30% attack speed before to showcase this, or like to test it. So I can confirm that does work, but I don't remember exactly what I did to get the last bit of cast speed, unfortunately. I think I had this active actually. I think that was it. No. I still need a tiny bit more cast speed just to showcase this. There we go. Now we have 30 casts per second, and would you look at that? Our bolt goes up to 30. Our damage just doubled. By going from 29 casts per second to 30, we just doubled our damage. So that was the last thing that I just wanted to showcase. You know, this is something I've only really seen on like channel skills being a big problem and on Reap being a big problem. I did make a sheet for Reap cooldown recovery, but TLDR, just get 9% Reap CDR and you'll be fine. You don't need more than 900. The next breakpoint is 1400. Anyway, YouTube, I think that's everything. This was just the thing I wanted to showcase quickly. The main point of the video was just showcasing how people can do their own spreadsheets and, in essence, do their own POBing. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a good time. Please like, comment, subscribe, all those good things. And come watch me live on Twitch. I'm live there every day from 5 PM GMT+2. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye-bye. Yeah.